red? Is it yellow? Is it green? Is it blue? So that's the color family or the color type. But let's say we pick one hue angle or one color family, yellow, here. What's really interesting here is that this is all the same wavelength of light being reflected off of this surface, but these are not all the same looking color to us, right? That's because this same wavelength of light can be reflected with different intensities. So that's basically the 3 dimensions of color. So it's the type of color family it is, and how light or dark it is, and how colorful or gray it is, right? So the 3 types of dimensions. So imagine if we have 2 axes, this is like a light and dark, so colors on this page go lighter this way and darker that way. And then this is our other axis, which is the softer and brighter direction. So colors going this way, you know, towards spring, let's say, or this side of the page, they go more colorful. And then going this way, they just go a little bit muted. So that's why autumn is a little bit more muted generally than spring. And that's why summer is a little bit lighter generally than winter. And anything that's a mixture, you know, like colors that are a mixture of autumn and summer, they'll be softer because they're more muted and they're lighter. Therefore, they're getting a little bit of gray and a little bit of white. So they kind of become basically softer intensities than, say, if it was a mixture of autumn and winter, which gets a little bit of starkness, so a little bit of darkness, but a little bit of muting, you know, so we experience these as sort of deeper, darker intensities. Take a seat.
Thank you.
So, is this your natural hair color?
No.
All right, can I ask you to tie it up?
Oh, yeah,
Thank you.
of course.
I'm gonna get you a cap, put you in a shower cap. Okay. We'll grey you out for the session just to make sure that anything that's not naturally part of your colouring we won't interfere with what we're doing.
Okay.
Okay. So, sorry, this is probably going to be a funny look. And I'll be putting a cape on you as well.
Thanks.
Okay. Just gonna tuck this in. Okay, is that comfortable?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, where shall we begin? Shall we begin? I'll probably just explain to you what we'll be doing basically for the next good couple of hours probably. It will be lots of flipping the drapes, but for you to, in order to understand what we're doing with the drapes and how we organize the colors and what we're comparing and how and why, I'm just going to quickly explain to you basically about colors a little bit and then the harmony groups that I work with. So, colors generally, people think of them as sort of like a solid thing, like a paint or a pigment, and that is kind of correct partially, but what most people sort of forget, that color is just a reflected light. So light, natural light, you know, that comes from the sun, it's basically a full spectrum light. And it's kind of like a whitish color, almost pure white, and it hits surfaces, like it hits this drape, hits all the surfaces, and the surface absorbs some of this wavelength of light, you know, the full spectrum, and it reflects some of the spectrum back. And whatever it reflects back, like this wall, this drape, these prints here, whatever they are reflecting back, it's basically the wavelengths that they haven't absorbed. So ironically, the colors that we see when we see a color is everything that the item is not, you know, all of the wavelengths that it is not, because it's reflecting it back. So that's kind of like an interesting little thing. Basically, if you think of color space like similar to this globe, but it's just not a perfect globe shape, it's sort of like a irregular shape. But in terms of talking about colors, we tend to, in this really 3D realm, we tend to think of their properties in 3 different dimensions. One dimension is the type of hue angle or type of color family that is, so basically what type of color of the rainbow it is. AKA, you know, is it red, is it yellow, is it green, is it blue? So that's the color family or the color type. But let's say we pick one hue angle or one color family, yellow, here. What's really interesting here is that this is all the same wavelength of light being reflected off of this surface, but these are not all the same looking color to us, right? That's because this same wavelength of light can be reflected with different intensities. So right here we've got full intensity where it looks like, let's say, pure pigment, but sometimes we can have lighter intensities, darker intensities, or just less and less colorful intensities. So basically, if we were a painter and think in terms of pigment, this would be a case of adding a little bit of white to a pure pigment, adding a little bit of black to a pure pigment, or adding gray, aka both black and white, you know, to not to change the darkness level, but just to get the color grayer and grayer and grayer until we reach a complete grayscale. So, and then what's really interesting here as well is that if I told you think of dark yellow, you wouldn't necessarily think of olive green, would you? Yeah. Like people think, oh, that's a green color when you look at them out of context, right? But it's just a dark intensity of yellow. That's why dark yellow doesn't actually exist in our vocabulary and in our minds, because we named it wrong. We named it green, but if we're looking at green, dark green, you know, it's a different color. It's not olive, is it? So olives are yellow.
Whoa.
Just a little interesting thing. Okay. Ooh, sorry. Okay, so that's basically the 3 dimensions of color. So it's the type of color family it is, and how light or dark it is, and how colorful or gray it is, right? So the 3 types of dimensions. And then based on that, we order them in this work that I do into different intensity groups at different temperatures. So here we've got them named according to the 12 seasons, and the only purpose of the 12 seasonal or the seasonal naming, not necessarily really to kind of for you to think of it very rigidly that it has to be summer colors that appear in the summer, because in the summer we have fruits, right, which are supposedly spring color, right? So like we don't need to think of them in a rigid way in terms of seasonality, but they just give us like very quick reference points for, you know, how to think of like a color space that is really luminous, like very warm and bright colors. You know, like if I said to you, oh, think of warm, neutral, medium intensity and high chroma colors, your brain is going, oh, what am I computing? But if I say bright spring, oh, suddenly a picture can pop up in your mind. So if you can almost like use the seasonal namings like little codes, you know, to kind of a quick reference for types of intensity and temperature combinations. Any questions so far?
Yeah, no, I think I'm okay so far. I didn't ever realise that the seasons didn't mean that it was like necessarily things you saw in that season. Mm-hmm. So it's more just groupings, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they give you feelings, right? Like, let's say if you think of winter, it's got a sort of starkness. So it's more like the qualities of the seasons give you sort of certain emotional, psychological associations, and then that kind of corresponds, you know, so like there are some qualities that we can overlap and kind of correspond, but it's not a direct, rigid system, because, you know, winter palettes, like bright winter, we'll have, you know, bright fuchsias and things like that, you know, and just we'll have a whole range of colors, you know, which will be a little bit springy, some of the colors in there, a little bit too vivacious for it to be like a stark winter day when everything, all the leaves are fallen, you know. So so basically, okay, so I talk you through how the 12 season system here that's based on the Sayat method, how it's divided up on the temperatures and the intensities. So you remember with the colors we had, for the same type of colors, we had light and dark dimension and soft and gray dimension. So imagine if we have 2 axes, this is like a light and dark, so colors on this page go lighter this way and darker that way. And then this is our other axis, which is the softer and brighter direction. So colors going this way, you know, towards spring, let's say, or this side of the page, they go more colorful, and then going this way, they just go a little bit muted. So that's why autumn is a little bit more muted generally than spring, and that's why summer is a little bit lighter generally than winter. And anything that's a mixture, you know, like colors that are a mixture of autumn and summer, they'll be softer because they're more muted and they're lighter, therefore they're getting a little bit of gray and a little bit of white, so they kind of become basically softer intensities than, say, if it was a mixture of autumn and winter, which gets a little bit of starkness, so a little bit of darkness but a little bit of muting, you know, so we experience these as sort of deeper, darker intensities. So yeah, so the neutral tones in between, so these are basically the sort of, let's say, traditionally true seasons, you know, like a winter, a summer, a spring, and an autumn. But there are kind of in between, let's say, mixes or neutral categories that we call them. And they normally are just a mixture of. So say if you were mixing spring with winter, then you can, dependent on how much of each you're mixing, you can get bright winter or bright spring sort of intensities. If it's still a little bit too cool tone, you know, more wintry directions, then you get into bright winter space, a bright winter intensity. If it's a little bit more warm tone still and lighter, then you would be getting basically into the bright spring intensity. But yeah, so the intensities that we're working with is light, you know, so colors that are, you know, not pure pigment, but just with a little bit of whitened kind of appearance, but still very clear. So they're not super grayed down. And then we've got the soft intensities, which are colors that, you know, they are getting grayer, you know, like they can be sort of more light rather than dark, but they're always a range, you know. It's not like, oh, the soft seasons only have very medium gray tones. No, they have a range of light and dark colors. It's just the overall appearance of each category that we're talking about when we're talking, you know, light intensity or soft intensity. And it's always because we're comparing it to all the other types of intensities, not just not as a standalone rule. So we've got light intensities, soft intensities, bright intensities, which is basically very chromatic, very pigmented, dark intensities that feel a little darker and richer. And then within that, we get warmer ones, cooler versions of the same intensity. So what's really interesting about the true seasons is that they're actually more medium intensity. So they're not as dark, they're not as grayed or soft, they're not as light, they're not as vivacious or vivid. They're actually a bit more medium in intensity. And true autumn and true winter, they're a little bit darker in intensity than true summer and true spring. So even within the medium intensity space, we get a little bit darker mediums and a little bit more lighter mediums, basically. So we can think of the neutrals as they are more neutral in temperature, but they're actually more extreme in intensity, whereas the trues, they're a bit more neutral in intensity, but they're a little bit more extreme in their temperature. So that's their kind of main differences. Okay, does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Sort of. It's probably a lot to take in, to be honest, at first. But it will be actually much easier once we start draping. I'm just explaining this to you at the beginning so that you can kind of start referencing some of the things that we're doing.
Yeah. And
then all we're going to be doing is comparing two things. Like, let's say we'll probably start with comparing light summer and light spring drapes to each other. Okay. So what they have in common is that they're both light and they're both clearer, so they're on this side of the grayness and colorfulness axis, so they're a little bit on the clearer than the soft, for example. But they're on this half, on the bottom half of the lightness darkness axis, so they're also lighter. So they're lighter and clearer colors, generally speaking, the whole palette. And when we compare them to each other, their main difference will be is that one group of drapes will be a little bit cooler, the other group of drapes will be a little bit warmer, you know, because these will be the warm neutrals, these will be the cool neutrals. And then we compare those two, and then we move on to the softs, the brights, the darks. We repeat the same thing, and we're looking to see when we're comparing them, you know, when their intensity are fixed, let's say, you know, they're very similar, but we're comparing their temperature. We're just looking for temperature related cues, basically, to see if we can pick up something quite obvious and if it's repeating on every type of intensity. Yeah, and then we'll compare the truths as well to each other. And then once we've seen examples of everything, then we kind of create almost like a personalized strategy based on what we've seen that far. Yeah, so I think we should just begin, and it will be easier to see when we get to that. Yeah, cool. All right.